right, well, I can't quite see how many people we have here. Let's see, 67. So yeah, I think we'll get started here. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Greg Stegall. I am the operations director here at Renewable Energy Alaska Project. And yeah, I'm excited about today's program. I am going to do just a brief little intro and then kick off the program. So I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. I am currently working from my home in Anchorage, which is on the traditional and unceded lands of the Dena'ina. REAP staff live and work throughout the entire state of Alaska and recognize the thousands of years of stewardship that Alaska Natives have had over these lands. I'd like to invite everybody to use the chat function to let us know where you are coming from, and please use the traditional and native lands that you're currently on. If you're unsure of which native lands you are on, there's a little website on this slide, native-land.ca, where you can look up which native lands you are on. So feel free to use that feature there to let us know where you're coming from. And then while everybody is doing that, I'm gonna just take care of a few housekeeping items here. First, we will, before we get into the presentation, I just want to give a little rundown on the program. Let's see here, sorry, turn my phone off. Yeah, we have a great presentation lined up from Jeff Schub, who I will introduce in just a moment here. And then we'll have a few words from our executive director, Chris Rose, and then we will leave plenty of time at the end for question and answers. So I want to encourage people to use the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen to ask questions. I would recommend everybody do that throughout the presentation as questions pop up. Put them in the Q&A feature there, and we might pull a few during the presentation, then save some for the end. Please don't use the chat function for questions because they're easily lost in there, but do feel free to use the chat if you want to share any relevant information or have any links or anything like that. And lastly, we will be recording this webinar. And let me just switch my view here. Sorry, there you go. Is that better? Let's get back to this slide here. Yeah, sorry about that. So we're recording this. We'll be posting this on our YouTube page, and we'll be sharing the link to that after. So please go ahead and share that with anybody who might be interested. So yeah, just briefly a little bit about REAP for those of you who are new here. We are a nonprofit located in Anchorage, Alaska, and we have a satellite office in Juneau. We are a coalition of over 70 members, and broadly speaking, our mission is to advance clean energy throughout the state of Alaska. We often talk about increasing clean energy through these 4 pillars. Technology is the one area we don't work directly in, but we try to interpret it. And then we work in the other 3 areas. So this topic today is something that REAP has worked a lot in over the past few years and falls in the funding pillar. On the policy side, we're working heavily in establishing an electric reliability organization for Alaska. And then in the people pillar, we have a large portion of our staff working on STEM education throughout the state. And I think I'll just leave it at that so we can get right into our program. I'd like to introduce Jeff Schub here. Jeff is the executive director for the Coalition of Green Capital. and he is working and has been working on establishing green banks throughout the nation. He is a leading expert on this topic. And with that, I will turn it over to Jeff to share your screen. I'll stop sharing here.
Yeah. Wonderful, thank you. All right, let's see if I can make this work.
Perfect.
Or does that look good on your end?
Yeah, you're not in slideshow mode, but we can see it.
You know, give me 1 second. I think I can actually fix that.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, how does that look?
Perfect.
All right, great. Thank you. So Greg, Chris, thank you so much for having me. Really excited to be part of this conversation. This is a very, very exciting and critical moment in the sort of history and development of green banks in the United States. And believe it or not, Alaska sort of sits at the center of a lot of that right now in ways that we can explain. So it's a really fantastic opportunity to speak with REAP and, you know, just to sort of say nice things about Chris for a while. His leadership on this topic in Alaska and the sort of, frankly, the national influence he has is incredible. We work in dozens of states across the country, and the kind of partnership that we get from REAP and from folks in Alaska is really, really stellar. So it's really a pleasure to be able to join you. I'm not in Alaska. I'm in suburban New Jersey in a town called West Orange, but before this was a suburban sprawl, actually sitting at the top of what's called the Second Watchung Mountains. That was originally Lenape territory, which is something I only discovered the last time that I participated in an Alaska-focused conversation. And so I really do appreciate that the tool that you all use to identify native lands that you're on. I think it's very smart and something that I'm happy to do here in New Jersey. So the Coalition for Green Capital is a 501c3 nonprofit that works around the world now with a lot of folks in the US on developing green bank institutions that use public funds to mobilize more private investment into clean energy. I'll speak a little bit in a moment about a little bit more detail about what that is and what green banks have been doing. Our organization wears a couple of different hats. We're advocates and educators. We work with policymakers, we work with stakeholders, we work with market participants to help folks understand what this model is and how it works, to increase awareness and support broadly. But we also do a lot of direct technical work, partnering with implementers and operators of green banks to help launch the institutions, design them, and support their operations. And then we're broadly sort of a field builder. We do a lot of thought leadership and publication. We also operate the American Green Bank Consortium, which is effectively the industry association that is now has a good number of members. I think we have almost 20 members now of green banks that either exist or are sort of in a nascent form. And, you know, slowly but surely over a decade of work in this space, the collective impact and support for those green banks has grown to a level it's never really been at before, which is why I say this is an exciting moment. So let me jump in and first just start by, you know, trying to define a green bank. It's honestly a little bit hard to define a green bank because it's a little bit more of a concept and a set of principles rather than a specific technical definition. But the one listed here is that green banks are mission-driven institutions that use innovative financing to accelerate investment in an equitable and prosperous clean energy and climate transition. So there's a lot in there, but what is this fundamentally actually broken down to? It's mission-driven, meaning it's not a profit maximizing private entity. It can be public, it can be private as a nonprofit. It uses innovative financing, meaning it's primarily a financing and investment vehicle, not a grant-making entity. It doesn't mean that sort of subsidies are not part of the equation, but it often means that the ways that green banks provide subsidies into clean energy transactions is more in the form of dedicating resources and human capital to try to execute complex transactions that otherwise wouldn't be completed, but for the use of public resources to get it done. The objective is to accelerate investment, which primarily means using public money to leverage private investment. If you follow this space at all recently, you've probably seen two really big trends that are sort of happening at the same time in the clean energy climate finance space. One is trillions of dollars of what I would call passive institutional capital moving to quote unquote ESG funds. The simple way of describing this is if anybody has money invested in a mutual fund or an index fund, a lot of funds are being created that are labeled as under the label of ESG, meaning environmental or social or governance conscious. I think the simple way of describing it is that money is chasing good and often climate related activities, but those funds don't really get the money there. And so that's one big trend where there's just a flood of money coming into the space, but it doesn't really know where to go. And the other big trend is basically every single major Wall Street bank in the last several months has announced a goal of having their investment portfolios be net zero emissions by 2050. What on earth does that mean? How do they get there? They don't even know. It's good that they've made those commitments, but they don't really know what that means. But take this together and it means that there's an incredible amount of private capital looking to invest in climate and clean energy related activity. The problem is a lot of the financial infrastructure that's necessary to connect that capital to projects doesn't exist. And a lot of the problem is, I think there is a desire and expectation that all of that money can get into climate and clean energy related activity without having any impact on the risk return profile that that capital is seeking. And that's fundamentally not true. And so public capital can play a big role of shepherding that money into the investments that and the projects it needs to get to, while also addressing risk return shortfalls, knowing that the investors are unlikely to suddenly say, hey, we're actually willing to only earn 3% on something rather than 10%. So that's the first half of this definition. The second half is, I think, increasingly prominent in discussions around the country: equitable and prosperous and clean energy and climate transition. Equitable meaning we have to be conscious of environmental justice, addressing low-income communities and disadvantaged communities, rural communities that are chronically underserved and left out of a clean energy transition conversation, households that are shut out of financing markets because traditional underwriting criteria like FICO scores or debt to income makes it prohibitive for certain households, even though the credit risk is not there. Prosperous means a number of things. If there is no way to quickly transition to clean energy unless this is A, saving people money on their energy bills, and B, creating new jobs. And you can see that echoed every day in what the president and the new administration says about clean energy and climate transition. This is not about punishing people into doing something that's good for them and eating their vegetables. This is about creating economic opportunity and benefits. And so green banks are an investment vehicle to sort of deliver that future. There are, as I said, there's a number of state green banks already operating around the country. The first in the US was Connecticut. The largest is New York. I have a map that I'll show in a second showing the full landscape. And so this data is now a year old and the new data is almost out. But through 2019, green banks have collectively driven over $5 billion of investment, where $1.5 billion of green bank capital was leveraging nearly $4 billion of total of private co-investment in projects. And so that often is through the provision of credit enhancements, loan loss reserves, junior subordinated debt, other sort of technical financing structures that are fundamentally a model of if there's a solar project to be built, the private sector puts in $3 and the public sector puts in the last dollar to make sure the project actually pencils out economically. And if you understand that, then you understand the green bank. That's fundamentally the core financing model. And these green banks are creating jobs, and we've seen data from Connecticut. We've seen data from other states. This is just direct investment in often in small businesses and contracting businesses to expand their market opportunity. If we think about the sort of addressable market that exists for a lot of these clean energy projects today, and imagine how much bigger they would be, how many more customers there would be if there was accessible financing on demand, and that's how you get to the job creation opportunity. And last but not least, as said here, we surveyed the existing state green banks across the country, and they collectively identified over $20 billion of project investment opportunity, meaning specific investment needs that are right in front of them, that if all they had was the capital to do this, they would actually get it done. And so that's the other big piece of the equation right now in the country, which is that we are, after a very, very, very long time moving this forward, we are getting very, very close to creating a national green bank through congressional action. There is a proposal, which is now a bipartisan proposal, for a $100 billion national green bank called the Clean Energy and Sustainability Accelerator. Now, the long history here is that the first national green bank was proposed all the way back in 2009, if folks remember, the prior effort to create a national cap and trade system, often called the Waxman-Markey bill. A national green bank was actually a part of that package, but it never came to pass because it was never voted on in the Senate, which basically put us all in the wilderness of there, in essence, not being any energy or environmental or climate policy in this country, or even an attempt at it for the last 12 years. But obviously the political stars aligned in a very, very specific and unique way between the election of Joe Biden to be president and the Senate elections in Georgia. There is a very, very specific moment of opportunity right now for significant climate and clean energy legislation. And so the accelerator, or the National Green Bank, sits squarely at the center of those conversations right now. The simple way to think about this is the first priority of the Biden administration was the relief bill, the $1.9 trillion bill that just passed. The second priority is the recovery bill. And as New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Washington Post started reporting on just 2 days ago, the administration and Congress are moving forward now to design the provisions and size of this next climate and infrastructure package, early indications of which are that it's going to be $3 trillion. And so why do we think the accelerator or National Green Bank will be part of it? So one is this bill actually passed the House of Representatives twice last year, which goes a long way. The House leadership knows what this is. They support it. It did get bipartisan votes last year, and so that sort of put us on a good pathway. That bill was co-sponsored and endorsed by then Senator Harris, now Vice President Harris, so that matters a lot. The Biden campaign, his clean energy plan, included specific references to leveraging private capital through innovative public financing mechanisms, i.e. a green bank. The legislation was reintroduced just a month ago for this session of Congress with bipartisan co-sponsors, including your Representative Don Young, which is, all credit in the world to folks on the ground like Chris in Alaska making this happen. And there are two Republican co-sponsors on the House bill right now. One is Don Young, the other is Representative Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania. And basically when Young came on, which was just a week ago, people's sort of eyes bulged out of their head. They were like, whoa, he's signing on to a $100 billion investment bill like this. That caught people's attention. We can get into the politics of whether or not this ultimately will pass with bipartisan support or if it needs bipartisan support. But suffice it to say right now, bipartisan support is really, really important and valuable because ultimately the House and the Senate have very, very narrow margins. And so the more bipartisan support, the better. The next big element of the pathway here is the Clean Future Act, which is a large package that the very powerful House Energy and Commerce Committee rolled out just 2 weeks ago as their blueprint for what they want climate policy to be, which the Biden administration is sort of in many ways using as a template. The Clean Energy Accelerator is the largest single budgetary line item of that package and was heavily featured in a hearing of that committee just a couple of days ago. And the bill is now endorsed far and wide by a lot of organizations, progressive groups like Data for Progress, more sort of central objective groups like National Academy of Sciences, all the organizations you see listed there, and many others. We have over 200 organizations signed on their letter of support. Most prominently, Alaska Power and Telephone is behind this bill, and they've been doing a lot of work to get other folks on board in Alaska, getting everybody from Data for Progress and NRDC to an Alaska-based utility to support this shows the kind of political reach this has, and it builds on the bipartisan support that this policy has had at the state level as well. What is the bill actually going to do? It basically will provide funding to state green banks across the country to finance projects in partnership with the private sector across these 7 different authorized sectors. So green banks historically have been pretty focused on distributed generation and building efficiency, not because they were constrained to do them, but it's because A, that's where the investment opportunity was, and B, they just didn't have enough capital to do more than that, and which has always been the biggest barrier to green bank growth across the country is there just simply isn't enough public money at the state level to do this. So the primary purpose of the National Green Bank is to provide capital to an Alaska Green Bank and a green bank in every other state so that they can invest across every one of these sectors listed. They all have job creation opportunities, they all do economic benefits, and they all reduce greenhouse gas emissions. An important feature of the policy, which would again translate all the way down to the state green banks, is that 40% of the investment capital from the accelerator has to go into disadvantaged communities. This is a consistent theme running across all federal policy conversations and increasingly most state policy conversations. This is about expanding access to clean energy, but honestly, it's a lot more about creating jobs, new businesses, wealth creation opportunities, opening up the broader economic benefits of the clean energy transition to more and more communities. And so with a really strict requirement and a floor of 40%, we think this is a tool for achieving a lot of what the Biden administration wants to do broadly with their climate and infrastructure policy, and is also, frankly, just sort of sensible investment, because if the objective of a green bank is to focus on investment gaps where where private money is struggling to reach, underserved communities are, the top of the list of a really obvious place where there are gaps that need to be filled. And this is the map of what's going on in the country, where there are green banks, where there are green banks in development, and where they need to be formed. And Alaska's down there in the illustrated bottom left, it's highlighted blue. There's a lot of work going on that Chris can speak to in more detail. But the thing that jumps out to me and most people when they look at this map is this map has, one, it's grown a lot in just the last year or two. But 2, it's growing to places that are not traditionally politically blue states. There's been a really positive feedback loop in the last year as more state leaders and stakeholders have seen what's happening at the federal level and seen the opportunity for a national green bank. States are moving because they're like, hey, I want to be ready to have a green bank that can receive this money just to get going, because there's not any time to waste, and particularly as I don't know if we can say we're coming out of COVID or still struggling with COVID. In New Jersey, we're still struggling. But we know that the need for this investment is critical for economic and job creation purposes. And so we really can't wait. And so states are moving ahead. So, we're working in states like, Montana and Utah and South Carolina and West Virginia needs to be on this map now, because we've got a lot going there too. And so you sort of see how this is spreading very quickly to other parts of the country. So this a really quick overview of the national landscape, what the green bank model is. I'm really, really excited about the role that Alaska is playing. I think, Don Young signing on to co-sponsor is obviously like a sort of a holy cow moment in the development of this at the federal level, but it reflects the, tried and true, shoe leather that's been, expended on the ground right where you are in your community to develop this policy further. So maybe with that, I'll hand it over to Chris to let him dive in and talk a little bit more about the Alaska opportunity.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks a lot for those kind words. You and your team have been instrumental in helping us in Alaska socialize this concept of a green bank. I think we first met when you came up to one of our conferences almost 10 years ago. So it has been a while that we have been talking about how to finance more clean energy in the state. And of course, have to also mention our friend Bert Hunter, Vice President of the Connecticut Green Bank, who's also been super helpful in trying to help us tell the story of how green banks work. And I think you did a great job of explaining what a green bank is. One of the things that I want to do is talk a little bit about why we care about a green bank in Alaska. A lot of people in Alaska will remember back in 2008 when the state legislature came up with $360 million in 1 year for weatherization and rebate programs that the Alaska Housing Finance Corporation was running to make our residential buildings more energy efficient. More than another 280 million, so a total of $640 million was eventually appropriated by the legislature for those HFC programs. $640 million in grants. People under median income got a $10,000 grant. People over median income ultimately got a $10,000 rebate if they put some money in. But HFC believes that collectively, those 50,000 plus homes that got retrofitted are saving about an average of 30% on their heating bills. So when that money ran out, we started working on other ways to keep that flow going, because not only did 50,000 homes in the state get retrofitted, there was, like I said, about 30% decrease in people's energy bills, but we also are saving about 30 million gallons of heating oil equivalent every year. And HFC was estimating at the time when a lot of stuff was going on, it was creating about 2,500 direct jobs. We estimate that there's probably another 100,000 homes in the state that could use that. So if we spend $640 million doing that work, let's double that. And as you pointed out before, Jeff, there's billions of dollars worth of investment. I think we can count up over $1 billion worth of potential investment just on residential energy efficiency in this state. And the way that REAP looks at this is energy efficiency is our first fuel. It's the thing that's always the fastest. It's the cheapest. It definitely brings a quick return for your dollar, but people don't necessarily have that kind of money up front. So a green bank is a very elegant way to get people into an affordable loan that typically has a much lower interest rate than they can get from their local bank, and more importantly, has more time to pay it back. And so what you wind up with is a lower interest rate, more time to pay it back. And now you're looking at a situation where rather than looking at a loan that is unaffordable to you, you're looking at a loan that could be cash flow positive even. You might actually wind up saving more money every month on your energy bills than you're paying back, or you're getting close to that. And so our first market that I think Coalition for Green Capital also confirmed when you did some work for the municipality of Anchorage last summer is residential energy efficiency. We've got thousands and thousands of Alaskans who would like to retrofit their homes, make their homes more energy efficient, make them more comfortable and be able to save money, but don't know how to get into those loans. Another market that Coalition for Green Capital identified from the municipality of Anchorage was the CPACE program. The legislature approved the option for municipalities to start what's called commercial property assessed clean energy programs back in 2017. So 4 years ago, authorizing legislation was passed, and the municipality of Anchorage has now got a CPACE program, and they're talking about kicking it off here relatively soon. That's very exciting. What CPACE does is allow for a tax assessment district or municipality like the city of Anchorage, municipality of Anchorage, to lend money to commercial building owners. In this case, that's where the C and CPACE comes from, commercial building owners, to borrow money to do energy improvements to their building or put rooftop solar on, and pay the loan back through a special voluntary assessment on their building. So when a building owner does that, they are going to pay a special voluntary tax assessment back to the municipality. And that, first of all, securitizes the loan more because people want to pay their property taxes, but it also allows a building owner who may think they're going to sell their building in 2 years to still improve their building, because whoever takes the building over later on is going to be the one who keeps paying that special voluntary tax assessment. That's another market where a green bank could really help, particularly in the administrative area. Because if we wind up getting a CPACE program in Anchorage and then one in Fairbanks, and they're interested, and Matt Sue's interested, and people in Juneau are interested, and Kenai are interested, we don't want to necessarily have 5 different administrative entities that are doing CPACE at a relatively small level. So a green bank could also, and has done and does do in other places, not only the role of administration for CPACE, but also can develop or put in capital to those CPACE programs. A third market that was identified is rooftop solar. And if I could show you this graph of what's going on with rooftop solar in the rail belt alone, it's a hockey stick. I mean, we're looking now at a very strong uptick in the people who are putting rooftop solar on. Many of them would do more, many more would do that if they could get a loan. I'm a great example. I've got good credit. I looked around to try to get a loan to put solar on my house. The best I could do was 8% in 10 years. If you had a program like, for instance, Connecticut's program or other green banks program, you could get a lot cheaper loan, more time to pay it off, and you'd be able to get into solar. So there are many different markets here. There are other emerging markets that we'd like to see a green bank help Alaskans with their energy needs. One of the things that's really exciting about the federal green bank bill to us is not only will it provide investment capital, that's important, but it's not as important actually as the fact that the federal green bank will also provide money for particularly nascent green banks who are just up and going, operations capital. There's a lot of money sitting on the sidelines, as Jeff already pointed out, that wants to get into the clean energy market, but they don't want to put money into hiring staff at a green bank. There's no return on that. One of the ways that I define a green bank is it's a quasi-governmental entity that does a lot of the heavy lifting up front to design programs and to design loan products and then to market them, because you've got to market these things so people know that they're out there. And none of those things produces a return on investment necessarily, no direct return. You've got to hire people, you've got to design these programs, you've got to market these programs. And importantly, the federal green bank bill specifically states that state green banks can get money from the federal green bank to hire people. It's unclear how long or how much money that is, but it's pretty certain that for the first 3 to 5 years or so, state green banks will be supported by a federal green bank. And that's important for us in Alaska, because I think a lot of people that I've talked to about this in the state of Alaska certainly get the notion, they understand, they want to support it. But the question often comes down to, well, where are we going to get this capital that pays for people to get this thing up and going? Because green banks don't necessarily start paying for themselves, until the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th year. And so there's going to be a time when, as that portfolio grows for the green bank, that they're going to have to, basically be losing money on the operation side. So that's important. A couple other things that I always try to point out to people about green banks that's super important to me is, A, it's not a grant program. And that's one of the issues that we've really had in Alaska for a long time, is we have a grant mentality. We've had so much money to flow out for grants that people keep expecting for the next grant program to materialize. And I think with a multi-billion-dollar budget deficit now for multi-years, it's clear to us that there's not going to be these big grant programs anymore. So this is not a grant program. This is actually a loan program that could make an investment for a quasi-state entity turn into a return. And it's also important to keep pointing out that this is not competition with the private sector. This, in other ways, and in many ways, it is a way for us to help open up a brand new market for the private sector. So it's about incentivizing the co-investment from the private sector, and many of the banks that we've been talking to over the last several years understand that now, and they would like to see something like this happen. So we've been looking at this idea for a while. I think we've been maturing its socialization over the last couple of years, and as Jeff pointed out, we think we're now at a tipping point when something can really happen. It's exciting to see Representative Young signing on to the House. If we can get our Senate delegation to also sign on to this bill, I think that could create a tipping point at the federal level, which, as Jeff pointed out, is $100 billion. Now that's $100 billion over 5 years. And again, it's most of that money is going into loans and helping other green banks do loans. So what have we been doing at the state level? We have been working for some time in the hopes that we could develop a statewide green bank, even before this federal green bank bill got reintroduced a year and a half ago. And we had a lot of interest from the municipality of Anchorage. They were interested in developing a municipal green bank, and that's not unheard of. Washington, D.C. has one. Cuyahoga County, which is in Cleveland, has one. A county in Maryland, Montgomery County, Maryland has one. So we were looking at that model. And in fact, that's why the Coalition for Green Capital was helping the municipality look at what the markets for a municipal green bank would be. But over the last 4 months, we've really, I think, accelerated some excellent conversations with the governor's office and with ADA, the Alaska Industrial Development and Export Authority. And of course, ADA does a lot of this kind of work. They do co-investment, they invest, but they're also in lots of projects around the state, but they're also working at a different level currently. They're working at a very large industrial level where we're talking about a small consumer level. Nonetheless, I think we are on the cusp of getting some legislation introduced, which is going to be fantastic because it'll give the legislature something to look at and to chew on. Certainly, we don't have that many weeks left in this year's legislative session, but hopefully by the time that something happens at the federal level, it'll be clear to our state legislators that it's a huge opportunity for Alaska to develop a vehicle like a statewide green bank that can be housed at a place like Ada, so that when the federal green bank does pass, we are in a position to receive that money and then start a green bank here in the state of Alaska. The markets that I mentioned, energy efficiency, rooftop solar, are really important. I spent an hour and a half this morning listening to a series of presentations from national groups in front of the Regulatory Commission of Alaska about electric vehicles, electric vehicle charging stations. And this is another huge place, I think, where both the federal green bank bill and a statewide green bank bill could also offer assistance. We don't know exactly how. I mean, you can probably get a loan for an electric car, no problem. That's always been one of the ironies, is you can go out and get a 3% loan on a car that depreciates the moment you drive it off the lot, but you can't get a 3% loan for making your house more efficient and saving you money that you could pay the loan back with. So, you know, we think that we're going to have multiple other spaces where a green bank in Alaska could really help accelerate private investment and help people save money on their energy bills. So that's an update about where we're at. It's been fantastic to work with Jeff and many members of his team over the years. And it's exciting to see that we are getting so close, both in Washington, D.C. And here in Alaska, to getting some legislation moving that can really, I think, accelerate a lot of people being able to make their homes and their commercial buildings more efficient and produce some of their own energy locally. So I'll stop there, and I think we've got plenty of time for some Q&A.
And if I could just jump in, actually just responding to two specific things that you said, Chris. One was about the need for startup funds. It's crazy to me. This is so often the case where a state, it's actually possible for a state to come up with like $10 to $20 million of investment capital to put into a green bank, but coming up with the like $250,000 for a single person is actually really hard. Like there's one state that we're working in where I won't name them, but we're pretty sure the green bank can get like $300 million for startup capital, but actually getting the budgetary space to hire like 1 or 2 people is harder. It's just a quirk of how the budgeting space works. And I think you're right that if we think about this as if you think about a green bank as a startup investment fund or a startup loan fund is a better way of saying it. Just like any startup, you need upfront investment capital to cover the operating expenses of that business until it can generate enough revenue to cover its own operating expenses. And As you said, Chris, that takes a couple of years, which is not unreasonable. But if you're a government entity or you're a nonprofit, you can't do what other startups do, which is raise equity. Why would an investor pony up that startup operating money for any sort of a business? It's because they own a share in the business and will get the benefits of the upside when there's profits. But this is a nonprofit or it's governmental, and so no traditional investor is going to want to put that money in to cover the operating expenses. So it has to come. This is what I often say is like the fuel in the tank to fuel in the engine to start the engine. That's usually the hardest thing to find, and so that's a really critical piece of what the National Green Bank will do. And then the other thing I wanted to say, just to be sort of overtly political about this, is if Senator Murkowski co-sponsors this bill, and that means that if a climate and clean energy package passes, the accelerator will be part of it, basically guaranteed. I can't tell you that it's guaranteed that this $3 trillion climate and energy package will pass, because that's up to sort of political gods that I definitely don't have any influence over. But if that package passes and the accelerator has Senator Murkowski's name on it, it will be a part of that package. I can guarantee you that. There's no doubt about that. So take that for what you will and how you want to spend your free time, who you might want to call or send letters to. But I'll try to leave the politics there. But I see there's a bunch of questions, so I'm happy to jump into those.
Yeah, we've got a hefty stash of questions here, and I've seen a few come in on the chat as well that I've tried to jot down. So yeah, please use the Q&A feature to keep asking questions. And I think I'll just rattle through a few if that's good with both of you, unless Chris, you see anything that you want to pick off right away.
No, go ahead. Great,
yeah, thanks. I think a quick one, and I think it was answered in the chat, but I'll just ask it. Just the House and Senate bill numbers for those federal pieces of legislation you mentioned.
Yeah, so the House bill is HR 806. The lead sponsor is Representative Debbie Dingell from Michigan. And then the Senate bill is Senate Bill 283. The lead sponsor there is Ed Markey from Massachusetts, along with Senator Chris Van Hollen. The better text to look at is probably the House version for reasons that aren't worth going into, but they're fundamentally the same bill.
Okay, thanks. And then I've got a good question here from Nancy Waterman asking about philanthropic capital and how that can interface with a green bank. Maybe you just want to touch on that generally.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's something that we've spent a lot of time thinking about. And to be honest, we spent some time wandering in the woods during the Trump administration, figuring out, like, could philanthropic capital play the role that public funds would? And I think the answer is having philanthropic money completely substitute for public money doesn't work. It's just not there at the scale, but it can play a really, really important and powerful complementary role, either with grant funding or sort of program-related investment, meaning instead of giving the money away as a grant, it can be lent out at sort of concessional terms or sort of subordinated terms or longer term. And foundations have done that. So a lot of green banks around the country have actually directly received PRI. The Connecticut Green Bank has had collaboration with the MacArthur Foundation. Kresge has made a number of PRI. And so there's actually a really great sort of symbiotic relationship there, because sometimes there's a part of the capital stack that philanthropy wants to fill in, particularly at the convergence between clean energy and multifamily affordable housing, where philanthropy does have more of a track record of that kind of program-related investment. So I think the idea of having a green bank fully capitalized by philanthropy is something we hope for. I don't know that the bandwidth is there, but certainly having them play sort of a co-investment role is a really great pathway to bring more of those philanthropic dollars directly into clean energy projects.
Thank you. And Chris, do you have anything to add on is there any talk of that with the Alaska specific sort of market study that happened?
No, I don't think there was anything more to add to that. I think it would be permissive if there was a way to get philanthropic capital in, and they were willing to play by the same rules as another capital investor would. I don't see that as necessarily a problem, but we hadn't seen that as a huge potential driver in Alaska.
Sure. Okay, and then I've got a question, from Jill Reese, about the possibility of applying for a commercial loan with a green bank before we get one set up in Alaska. So, and I think that's just a good question, kind of generally how green banks function across state lines.
So I guess the way I look at this is a lot of the work that our organization is doing in states around the country is basically getting as specific as possible to line up and identify the pipeline of true project investment needs in that state in advance of the passage of the legislation. And it's useful for two reasons. One is the most common question that federal policymakers ask is, all right, you've explained to me what a green bank is, but tell me, what is this actually going to do? What's actually going to happen on the ground in my state? And so having very specific projects to point to or numbers of potential projects is worth a ton for that conversation. It's the only thing that brings it to ground. So it's useful to get that information in advance for that sort of discourse. But the other thing is, as I said before, the money's gonna have to move quickly. And so doing everything that can be done to line up loans and investment opportunities so that we don't have to go searching for them the day the bill passes means everything moves more quickly. And so I think being systematic about collecting that information is useful, which is hard. It's not an easy thing to do, but it's something that CGC is trying to do more methodically in all the states we're working in.
Thank you. And then I have a follow-up from the chat that I had seen about, so if everything goes kind of according to how you'd like to see it go on the federal side and following with the Alaska legislation, what kind of time frame are we looking at for how soon people in Alaska could see loan opportunities that they could take advantage of?
So I'll speak to this on the federal side, and maybe Chris, you can speak on the state side. On the federal side, I think there was a universe in which a federal climate infrastructure package moved just as quickly as the relief bill, using the sort of esoteric technique called budget reconciliation, which is a way to pass a spending measure avoiding the filibuster. That's how the relief bill passed, and they did it in a month and a half, basically. There was a chance that the infrastructure bill would pass the same way. Basically, Senator Manchin said he's not going to do that, which doesn't mean that reconciliation is off the table. He's not going to allow a process where it went straight in that direction. So the estimates we're seeing and feeling out from the White House and from Congress indicate that this probably passes sometime between maybe late July and October. I think that's the hope. Congress is on recess for August, so maybe they get it in before the recess. I think realistically, the ultimate window where this could even possibly pass closes in February. So February 2010 is when the Affordable Care Act passes, which is really like the very last possible date where you could pass something in the president's first term before the midterms, at which point, Congress is just not really active anymore. But I don't think it's going to drag out that long. And if it does, something bad has happened. And so basically, let's just say roughly 6 months from now is when the federal bill could pass. Chris, you know more about the sort of legislative calendar in Alaska to sort of think through the mechanics of that.
The latest I've read in the papers is that our legislature is going to keep in session until mid-May, roughly. But they also have their hands full. I mean, they have to pass a budget. They have to figure out where to get the money to pass a budget. They've got other issues that they need to deal with. We're hoping that this legislation can get introduced soon, so that it could at least see the light of day, and possibly even have some committee hearings this year. The likelihood of getting legislation passed in our two-year legislatures is usually pretty unlikely and super unlikely when something starts this late. So it's way more likely that this would get passed sometime next year after a federal bill were passed. And then if it does pass and it does reside at ADA, then Ada would have to write regulations. The Attorney General would have to write regulations, and they would have to be approved so that we can actually implement the program, get it set up. So it is a lengthy process. It's likely to be, at least a year from now, I would say, before we'll be looking at, a better idea of when we could actually get something up and running.
Great, thank you. Now, you mentioned CPACE. There's a couple questions about providing just some more details on the status of the CPACE program. I know the Muni is having a launch event next week on CPACE. Do you have any more kind of details on that?
I don't have the date and the time of that. I know I'm signed up for that, Greg, but if you have that, maybe you can put it in the chat.
Yeah, it's on April 1st at noon, I believe.
Okay, and I know there's limited space for that, that you had to register in advance, but there might still be space. That is going to be a great opportunity for people who want to get the nitty-gritty details on CPACE at the municipality of Anchorage. So I guess that's a week from tomorrow. The municipality of Anchorage was the first municipality to actually develop a CPACE ordinance and then have the municipal assembly pass it. So that got passed last October, which means the municipality has been, working on setting up that program since then. And as you mentioned, is now about to launch it. I know that the folks in Fairbanks are highly interested in this. People in Matsu are interested, and as I mentioned, some other tax assessment districts. Of course, CPACE or Property Assessed Clean Energy Anywhere doesn't work unless you have a place that has property taxes in the first place, because that's the mechanism. My understanding is that even without a green bank, the CPACE program in municipalities can easily move forward because there are so many banks in the area that want to provide those funds. Those funds would have to be channeled through the Muni so they can get paid, they get channeled back through the Muni in the form of a voluntary tax assessment. But it appears to me that CPACE loans will be available relatively soon in the municipality of Anchorage.
Great. And then I've got another question from the chat. I think this was from David Thomas, who's with Homer Electric Association. He was mentioning a line of credit program that they have for their customers. And I know there's been some chatter about on-bill financing. So I'm just curious kind of how green banks in other states are interfacing with utilities or working with on-bill financing. Do those kind of work together, or are they functioning independently?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So on-bill financing, I sort of think of in the relationship to a green bank is kind of similar to CPACE in that they're both mechanisms by which financing can be delivered and repaid. There's the thing that sort of has to be figured out is whose capital is actually going through that system. And as Chris said, very often in the case of commercial PACE now, there's a ton of private capital and you don't need public capital to play much of a role. Although I think that for smaller projects, less than $250,000, there's usually sort of a little bit of a financing gap. And it's similar on utility on-bill programs. Sometimes utilities are directed that it has to be utility capital that's actually being used to finance the project that's being then repaid on the bill. Sometimes it can't be utility money. Sometimes it could be, but it's up to them. So part of it is just figuring out whose capital. But a lot of it, honestly, is in both the case of CPACE and on-bill financing, these programs are just like crazy complicated to implement and operate. And someone, to the point that Chris was making, someone's got to take on that operating expense of actually doing all the work to set it up and make it work. Particularly in the case where, I think the track record with on-bill financing, honestly, around the country is utilities can be pretty reticent to actually, unless there's sort of a specific mandate, they can be pretty reticent to like operationalize those and put any heft behind them. And so green banks can play a role either in taking on some of that responsibility or providing sort of risk mitigation to utilities so that they feel comfortable putting their capital through those kinds of programs to know that they're going to get repaid.
Yeah, and it's important to point out that green banks have a lot of flexibility in designing programs that work with the local conditions. And so if there was an opportunity for an Alaska Green Bank to collaborate with utilities that wanted to offer on-bill financing, that that would certainly be something that could be looked into if the utilities themselves didn't seem to have the capital to loan out in the first place.
Thanks. And then back to the Alaska draft legislation on creating a green bank. Does it specify how the Alaska Green Bank would be structured, public or quasi-public? There's another question about green banks being nonprofit. So maybe you could just kind of speak to the structure of,
Sure.
of the Alaska Bank. Yeah.
Well, the draft legislation would house the green bank at ADA, and ADA is a public corporation that provides a return, a dividend back to the state of Alaska. So it is not a state agency, but it's certainly quasi-public. And that's where we are looking to house the green bank right now, is at ADA.
And on the specific question I saw around the green banks being nonprofit, so you're right that I forget who asked the good question. It was Dave. Because green banks are nonprofits, they themselves cannot take advantage of the federal tax credit, but they often are able to participate in structuring, creating structures where there is private tax equity investment. So what that basically means is they're allowed to create subsidiary special purpose vehicles where a green bank could either provide subordinated debt or debt into that sort of vehicle, or even be a direct owner. Like the Connecticut Green Bank, one of the first products was a solar lease product in the state of Connecticut. This was many years ago when solar leases weren't actually that abundant. And the Connecticut Green Bank was the sponsor equity to that fund. There was a separate private bank that provided the tax equity investment so that they could take the tax credits. And so, yeah, you're right that by being either governmental or nonprofit, a green bank can't itself absorb tax equity, but it's able to create structures that allow others to participate with tax equity and get the benefit of that tax credit.
Hey, Greg, I'd like to handle a question that I see about typical financing terms, because I think that's important to a lot of people. It's an on-the-ground fact. And I'll give an example of a program that I really like and would love to see in Alaska that Connecticut pioneered, called the Smarty loan program, which is a residential energy retrofit product. And there's a range of interest rates and terms that are offered. And I think this is really important to explain the connection between a green bank and its private capital partners, because the range of interest rate is still going to depend a little bit on a person's credit rating. And this is where we get into a situation where the green bank can actually leverage a lot of the staff at these private banks. So you'd still be underwriting the loan through your private bank in this case, and the Smarty loan program. If Bank X was putting money into that Smarty loan program in Connecticut, they could decide that customer A has a good credit rating, therefore we're going to give them the lowest rate, which I think for that program is 3.99%. I think that range goes up to maybe 6.5% or 7%, depending on the size of the loan and the length of the loan and so on. So that's such a popular program in Connecticut that the Connecticut Green Bank spun off a whole nonprofit called Inclusive Prosperity Capital to help other states use that particular residential program in other places. So that range in Connecticut is 4 to 7%. The other thing about that program that's just mind-blowing to think about is those are unsecured loans. You can get that unsecured loan through the Connecticut Green Bank, and so that's a very, very hard thing to get if you're going to your local bank and saying, hey, I want to borrow $25,000 to do some work on my house. They're usually going to want to securitize the property if they can.
And I know we're at the bottom of the hour here. Let me see if I could just run through a couple of good questions that have been asked. So one is on green banks as direct or secondary lenders, a really good question. The simple answer is that it varies. The objective is for the green bank to usually not be a direct lender, but to rather be providing a warehouse facility for others to actually go originate the loans or to credit enhance others to make the loans. They often are trying to create secondary markets, so they'll also aggregate loans made by others. And so there's not a simple answer, but it sort of depends on what breakdown in the financial system is. What was another question? Oh, here's a good one. So COVID relief stimulus funding for launching this. That's actually something we've been looking at internally. The simple technical answer is yes. So the way the legislation was written that was just passed, it says that, I think the key phrase here is that funds can be used to address, relieve economic harm caused by COVID. And every state in the country has experienced job losses, specifically in the clean energy sector. And so there's no question that investing in this stuff actually would be a qualified use of federal funds. I think the difficulty is, you know, as Alaska well knows, some states came through this relatively unscathed with their state revenue declines, and some didn't. So in New Jersey, for example, where I am, state revenue fell by only 1% below expected. And so we actually think there's a good chance to use those relief funds for a green bank, because it's not like there's a massive budget hole to fill. Alaska's at the exact opposite end of the spectrum, where I think from the analysis I've seen, state revenues down like 40% below expected. So making a political argument to use those funds for this may be difficult, and you all know the landscape there better. But we're actually actively looking at, since that we already know that money is in hand. So I'll stop there, but I also put in the chat the email address for my colleague who has done a lot of the work in Alaska, for folks who want to follow up and talk more specifically about sort of project ideas and specific ways of getting involved in this work in Alaska.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, that's great. And I would also recommend, Coalition for Green Capital's website has a ton of great information. I know I'm on their mailing list, and their newsletters are very informative if you want to keep up to speed on that. So maybe Jeff, or I see that Ahmad is on, maybe you could drop a link in the chat for your website to let people poke around there. And yeah, I think we should probably cut it off. I give maybe Chris, one last chance to make some closing comments, but yeah, we are just a couple minutes past 1 here. Yeah, and I think people are curious about kind of how to learn more. So, maybe if you have any ideas there, Chris, that'd be great.
Well, we'll keep information updated on our website. When a bill gets introduced, we'll certainly let people know and let them know what some talking points are that they can use with their local legislator. That's coming up soon, I hope. So keep your eye on our website. And we'll also be posting information that people can use to write our senators and to write Representative Young and thank him for what he's been doing. So I would encourage people to look into writing our delegation in Congress and support the Accelerator Act. And I just want to thank Jeff again and his colleagues for all the work they're doing. And we'll look forward to the next event.
Thanks so much, Chris and Greg. Really appreciate it. And thanks everybody for coming.
Yep.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, and thanks everybody for attending. Yeah, please, we'll be sending out a follow-up email here, and if you have, there's a lot of questions in the chat that we didn't get to. Please reach out to me if you want to get those answered, and I can try to respond or pass them along. So yeah, thank you everybody for joining us, and we'll hope to see you at our next speaker series event on April 7th, where we'll be kind of picking up where we leave off here and talking about clean energy jobs in Alaska. So yeah, thanks all. Thanks, Jeff and Chris and everybody else, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right, take care.